Ask the clerk to call the roll.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr.
you're
Chairman.
denying us an
All right.
opportunity to
Mr.
speak
Come
on a
on, man.
nominee?
I mean,
Third time, no.
okay, do this.
So
Just
we don't
do
have a
it.
right to speak under the rules?
Under the third time, I'd say no.
So you're just going to make it up?
So, yeah.
I'd like to
There's
speak
going to be a lot of
to-
consequences
I'd like
coming
to
here.
speak to him, Mr.
You're going to have a
Chairman.
lot of consequences coming if you go down this road.
You better
I've
believe
cautioned
it.
you. I've cautioned a lot of you.
The clerk will call the roll.
Listen to me. I've cautioned a lot of you.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chairman, don't we get the opportunity to speak?
We're in a roll call.
So you're
Even,
telling
even
us
though
to shut up?
even though multiple
You
members
want
have
us
asked to
to
speak,
shut up? Is that what you're saying?
A lot of people didn't speak on the two nominees before.
We've done,
Did you raise your hand if you did not speak?
I did not have a
Senator
Okay.
Corn didn't even have a chance to speak.
Senator Blackburn had a chance to speak.
we've got several folks, Mr. Chairman, who didn't have a chance to speak.
We want to tell you again why these nominees are awful.
Or in Senator Corn's case, tell you for the first time. You're just going to sit there and ignore us?
Senator Blackburn, have you spoken on these nominees?
I've not had the
you like
opportunity to
to?
speak. I would like very much to speak on Mr.
Mr. Chairman,
Casaby.
I urge you to let Senator Blackburn speak.
Senator Corn as well. Senator Corn hasn't had a chance to speak.
That's correct.
Mr. Grassley.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. You can't limit debate without invoking Rule 4. You haven't done that.
we have debated.
Mr. Grassley.
We've debated on prior occasions when we didn't have a quorum. That vote didn't count. We've got people who are here now who weren't here then who would like to speak.
Can we speak on the other nominees?
Or is your plan just to end all debate today? Is your plan to end all debate? Do you have an answer? You're going to rely on someone whispering in your ear. What's your plan?
No.
No, we're not. Okay, listen, here's the deal. We worked 7 weeks to trying to solution the asylum problems. You boycotted the committee.
Mr. Cruz.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if you've left us any alternative but to deny the committee a quorum.
Mr. Cotton.
I think that's something we ought to seriously
I tell
consider.
you what,
Mr. Cotton says the chairman needs to rethink his decision
Yeah,
and let Senator Corn and Senator Blackburn speak. That's what Mr. Cotton says. You can mark that down as my vote.
Mr. Kennedy.
Yeah,
And everybody over there who's not willing to look at me or look at Dick Durbin needs to think about it as well.
Kennedy.
I want to speak.
Mr. Tillis.
Mr. Kennedy wants to speak as well. Mark Mr. Cotton down saying Mr. Kennedy needs to speak too.
Mr. Tillis. Mrs. Blackburn.
I'm waiting to be heard on the nominee. I've requested several times to be heard on the nominee.
So no, I guess Senator Durbin's not going to allow women to speak either. I thought that was sacrosanct in your party.
Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 11.
The nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. Up next is Judge Yumi Lee, nominated to the U.S. District Court for the,
Mr. Chairman,
who has not been allowed to speak on that nominee?
Mr. Chairman, you just destroyed
Yeah.
one of the most important committees in the United States Senate.
Chair would note.
And you set a precedent,
The chair
which
would
will
note-
be repeated every time one party or the other takes advantage and takes the low road.
Chair will note
It
that
sets a
both nominees
precedent
have
that
been
will then
debated twice.
become the norm.
Kashibai and
Congratulations on destroying the United States Senate Judiciary Committee.
Up next is Judge Yumi Lee, nominated to the U.S. District Court for the Northern
Who
District
has
of
not
California.
spoken on this nominee?
Clerk will call the roll.
Will you raise your hand? Look at all these people who have never said a word before you make them vote. Never said a word before you make them vote.
Ms. Klobuchar.
Just going along with it.
Mr. Coons.
Just going along with it.
You know,
Mr.
when we were in
Coons
the
said he would
majority,
allow members to speak.
Mr. Chairman, when we were in the majority, we allowed Democrats to speak ad nauseum, at great length. We never did this.
Mr. Blumenthal.
Both of these nominees have had 2 opportunities for speeches by members.
Mr., you have to bring them up again. It wasn't our fault, it's your fault.
Mr. Ossoff.
Going right along with it.
Mr. Welch. Ms. Butler.
Mr. Chairman, I hope you're proud of yourself.
wrong to Dick Durbin, the chairman?
Yeah, you really have. I don't know what drives this, Dick. I really don't.
Mr. Chairman, is it you driving it, or is it your staff
Yeah, is Joe
driving it?
Zogby the
Or is
chairman
it
of this
the
committee, or
White
is it
House
you?
driving this? This is completely inappropriate not to let us be heard on these nominations, and you know that.
Mr. Graco.
Your own members have told you to let them speak.
Mr. Cornett. Mr. Cornett. Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz.
This is a complete disgrace.
Maybe you can share
I
with us.
see my colleagues over here who understand what goes around comes around.
I mean, this is so unnecessary to ruin the committee over a political exercise that's going nowhere. Senator Whitehouse,
I would like to, was my name called? I can't hear. Where's that voice?
Was he recognized to speak?
We're on a roll call.
Ma'am? I'd like to speak, please.
We're on a roll call.
Mr. Tillis. Mrs. Blackburn.
I'm waiting to be heard on the nominations.
Mr. Coons.
Is this an illegal vote?
Chair Durbin.
So now Joe Zogby is going to dictate to other senators how they're going to vote?
On this vote, the ayes are 10.
The nomination will be favorably reported. We now turn to nominations that have not been debated before the committee, and the committee is open to
Mr.
conversation.
Chairman, I seek to speak on Seth Aframe.
Well, that is the next nominee, and you're
And-
recognized.
And I thank you for that. I have made it clear that I will not support this nomination, and there is a good reason for not supporting him, Mr. Chairman. The White House really does not have a good record when it comes to this seat. Back in February, I voiced my opposition to Mr. Delaney, Michael Delaney, who was nominated for this very same seat. Well, Mr. Delaney, we found out, had used hardball tactics against a 15-year-old survivor of sexual assault. He did this in order to protect an elite private school that wanted to cover up the disgusting conduct that had been perpetrated against this young woman. Now, Mr. Delaney threatened to name, to shame, and to humiliate her by removing her anonymity if she had the audacity to come forward and tell her story. Now, fortunately, at least one of my Democratic colleagues had the moral clarity to join us in sinking Mr. Delaney's nomination. Now, after the Delaney debacle, you would think that the White House would have learned their lesson. And I thought they would have the decency to nominate someone who actually had a track record of protecting women and children, and it seems I was wrong. The president has chosen to nominate someone very similar to Mr. Delaney and his disregard for the well-being of children, and that is Seth Aframe. And I recently spoke on the Senate floor about this nomination, so I'd like to walk my colleagues through the two cases that Mr. Aframe prosecuted that automatically, in my opinion, automatically disqualify him from service on the federal bench. Now, in each of these two cases, Mr. Aframe recommended sentences far lower than the guidelines for heinous, unimaginable crimes against children. One of the defendants was guilty of unconscionable acts of sexual violence against a 14-year-old girl with a hearing impairment. This precious child was kidnapped. She was taken to an abandoned motel in Vermont, and she was raped. Despite all of this, Despite what happened to this child, Mr. Aframe, as the prosecutor in this case, recommended a sentence far below the probation officer's suggested guidelines. It is clear that Mr. Aframe wanted a low sentence. And let me read you why. And these are his words. He wrote, and I'm quoting, "This low sentence will incapacitate the defendant until he is in his 60s. Hopefully, by that time, the danger that the defendant presents will have subsided." End quote. Mr. Chairman, that is repulsive. It is disgusting. And you have a 14-year-old girl that was hearing impaired that was forced to go through this rape and this sexual violence with a man, and then you've got a judge who says, well, maybe by the time he's in his 60s, he will not want to do that anymore. That is disqualifying from someone to sit on the federal bench. What is a woman? What is a girl? What are they going to think when they go before this man? Now, the other case that I want to bring up, the defendant in the other case had created 6 videos of himself sexually abusing a 3-year-old girl. 3 years old. Now, many of us are parents and grandparents. I want you to think about this. Think about a 3-year-old girl being sexually abused, not once, not twice, not 3, not 4, not 5, 6 different times. 6. Think about this. This is a 3-year-old toddler. How many of you have 3-year-olds in your lives? I do. To me, this is repulsive. So let's talk about the sentence in this case. Well, Mr. Aframe decided he was going to recommend 60 years, but what was the sentencing guideline on this? It was life in prison. If he had given him life in prison, he wasn't going anywhere. He was locked up. 60 years, well, maybe the guy can get probation. So Mr. Aframe himself noted in the sentencing memo that he was asking for something lower than life in prison. When I pressed Mr. Aframe about this under oath, on why he refused to recommend life in prison, he misrepresented the facts. So let me again set the record straight. The sentencing memo that Mr. Aframe wrote himself stated that the guidelines recommend a sentence of life in prison for raping this child. That, Mr. Chairman, is a fact. Regardless of what your staff is whispering in your ears, that is a fact. So I am going to ask my Democratic colleagues to join me in voting no on Seth Aframe. The man is morally unfit to sit on the federal bench.
Mr. Chairman, may I speak on this?
Of course, Senator Graham's recognized.
Thank you. When I had a discussion with Mr. Aframe, as I recall it, this idea you age out in terms of being whatever you want to call the guy was unnerving to me. I am never going to put somebody in a position of legal authority who believes and hopes that by the time one of these pedophile types are in their 60s, they are no longer a threat. I hope you all understand his reasoning here. There is no information that I know of to suggest that makes any scientific sense. Just think about what I said. We're about to put a man on the Court of Appeals who, when he was in the trenches, justified a sentence that was under what it should be, based on the idea that by the time he gets in his 60s, hopefully he will not be a threat. The best way to make sure that that logic doesn't infiltrate the American legal system is to deny this man a position of responsibility, of high responsibility. This would be the last guy I would entrust with responsibility of our legal system based on that single statement and the reasoning behind it.
Anyone else seek recognition? Senator Cotton?
Mr. Chairman, I'd also like to make a few comments on the nomination of Seth Aframe. I hear talk about Mr. Aframe having been a prosecutor as if he's somehow tough on crime. But even when he's supposed to be the criminal's adversary in court, he finds a soft spot for them. For example, in one particularly heinous child pornography case, Mr. Aframe refused to recommend a life sentence for the abuser, even though that's the sentence called for by the sentencing guidelines. Instead, Mr. Aframe asked to reduce the sentence to 60 years and give the criminal supervised release instead. Now, that may seem like a long time, but honestly, even a life sentence, or as far as I'm concerned, the death penalty, would have been far too lenient for this depraved criminal. We're talking about a criminal who filmed himself raping a 3-year-old girl. Let me repeat that, raping a 3-year-old girl, after he spent years having gotten close enough to her family that they even consider him as a potential legal guardian for their daughters. The details of the case are much more heinous than just that. I know some Democrats on the committee think that child pornography laws are too harsh. They're wrong about that, but we're not talking about some minor child pornography offender here, someone who happened to have an image on a computer. We're talking about producing, making the worst, most depraved, heinous imaginable child pornography and infiltrating the home and family of his victims to do it. Somehow, though, Mr. Aframe thought that this criminal deserved leniency and refused to ask for even the recommended sentence for his crimes. So I ask my Democratic colleagues, are you on the side of Mr. Aframe or a 3-year-old girl who was violently raped?